In 1994, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt stopped beside a dusty hill in southeastern Turkey in the province of Şanlıurfa. Local people were sure there was nothing special under it. A Byzantine cemetery maybe, some medieval structure. 30 years earlier, archaeologists from the University of Chicago had reached roughly the same conclusion and left. It took Schmidt one day to realize they were off by 11,000 years. What lay beneath that hill overturned the schoolbook version of how civilization began. And the strangest part is that we still don't really understand why it was built. Göbekli Tepe is called. The name means very simply pot-belly hill. Today, we'll try to understand what happened there 12,000 years ago. Before Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists were broadly confident about one thing. Hunter-gatherers couldn't have built anything this complex. The old model was neat and comfortable. First, people learned to grow food. Then they settled in villages. Then came surplus, order, division of labor. And only after that came sanctuaries, monuments, architecture, all the things we call the beginning of civilization. Then Göbekli Tepe rose out of the earth, and that model began to fall apart. What emerged was a vast ritual complex from an age we used to imagine very differently. Construction began at least around 10,000 BC, and some hints reach even deeper, towards 12,000 BC. This was a time when people here had not yet domesticated animals, had not planted fields in the familiar sense, did not live in states, and did not know of writing, metal, or pottery. And still, they hauled multi-ton stones, set them in circles, carved them with reliefs, buried them, and built again.
You look at it, and you can almost feel the neat schoolroom ladder of history start to wobble. History did not move in a straight line. It tore, looped, doubled back, and made sudden turns. Göbekli Tepe is one of those turns. The name of the place is almost mockingly simple. Not City of the Gods, not Gate of the Ancestors, not Sacred Mountain. Göbekli Tepe means pot-belly hill, or hill with a belly. People say its shape looked like a heavy old man lying on his back, pushing a great belly up toward the sky. It almost sounds funny. But behind that everyday name hides the oldest and most mysterious monumental complex on Earth. To feel its age, ordinary comparisons are almost useless. Take Çatalhöyük, the famous Neolithic settlement in central Turkey, often called one of the oldest towns in the world. Göbekli Tepe had already been standing for 2,500 years when the first people at Çatalhöyük were just laying out their homes. That is about the gap between us and ancient Rome. And the Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2,550 BC. Between you and Giza, there is ancient Greece, Alexander the Great, Rome, the Bible, the Quran, the European settlement of the New World, electricity, steam engines, world wars, the atomic bomb, spaceflight, the internet. And now the key point. The span of time between you and Giza is shorter than the span between Giza and Göbekli Tepe. There is old, there is ancient, and then there is Göbekli Tepe.
For me, this place does not feel like a museum. It feels as if someone pulled the rug out from under the entire familiar story of history. The roots of this story reach back to around 13,000 BC, into a world that would look almost alien to us. The northern hemisphere was still held by giant ice sheets. Woolly mammoths walked the plains. There was no metal, no writing, no potter's wheel, no bronze swords. Stonehenge did not exist even as someone's vague idea. People lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers and survived by hunting and collecting wild plants. We like to picture them in caves and portable shelters, as if life was nothing but movement. But even then, many things were already beginning to change. The Fertile Crescent, the arc of habitable land running from Egypt through the Levant to southeastern Turkey, was an ideal place long before anyone invented scientific terms for such places. As the northern glaciers began to retreat, parts of this world transformed. From around 13,000 BC, hunter-gatherers in the Levant began settling in villages of the Natufian culture, a people who were still hunting and gathering, but already living in something close to permanent homes. That culture was named by the British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod. In 1928, she excavated one of the caves of the Levant and described the culture after Wadi an Natuf. Her discoveries showed something important. These were permanent settlements, homes, shared life, places people returned to, and all of it appeared before full-scale farming. People could already live in settled communities without becoming farmers. Later, many Natufian settlements declined because of cooling connected to the Younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap near the end of the Ice Age. The Fertile Crescent once again became harsher, drier, and colder. But the Natufians matter precisely because they prove that the idea of settled life before farming already existed. People had already begun to move beyond the old nomadic pattern. That step prepared the ground for what would happen on Potbelly Hill. We still know frighteningly little about Göbekli Tepe. It was discovered in the mid-1990s, but only a small part has been excavated. A geomagnetic survey in 2003 showed at least 20 separate stone circles hidden inside the hill. Researchers have stressed many times that what has already been uncovered may be only a tiny fraction of what still lies underground. But the overall outline is visible, and that is enough to unsettle you. The first building activity here may have begun as early as 12,000 BC. The main work happened around 10,000 BC, in the early pre-pottery Neolithic, the period before pottery appeared. Instead of today's dry-looking land, fields of wild wheat stretched around the hill. Trees grew with nuts and fruit. Herds of gazelles moved through the region. To people of that time, it may have looked like a garden, a place where the earth itself gave more than usual. Why they chose this particular hill, we do not fully know. But the hill itself does not seem to have been just a random rise on the horizon. New topographic studies suggest that the builders used the natural stepped limestone terrain as the foundation for their special buildings. Nature had already given them a stone stage. They turned it into something deliberate. People began cutting limestone pillars and dragging them to the construction area. Some blocks weighed nearly 17.6 tons, 16 metric tons. They separated them from the bedrock not with bronze or iron, but with flint tools. The stone was quarried about 330 feet, 100 meters from the site. That sounds close, but only until you imagine a multi-ton block with no wheel, no draft animals, and no metal. Those 330 feet become a trial for an entire community. A handful of random people do not do this between a hunt and an evening fire. You need hundreds of hands. You need organization. You need food for the workers. You need a shared rhythm. Everyone has to move together. Here's the important twist that brings the legend of the world's first temple back down to earth. Archaeologist Lee Clare, summarizing the work from 2015 to 2019, writes directly that the older image of Göbekli Tepe as an isolated home of the first temples has to be revised. More and more evidence points not to an empty temple on a hill, but to a settlement with a very strong ritual component. The story does not become simpler, it becomes more complex. Not people did not live there, they only prayed, but a place where life and ritual may have been intertwined much more tightly than we once thought. At Göbekli Tepe itself, there are almost no traces of ordinary permanent life, no clear living spaces, no water source directly on the site. The nearest water is about 3 miles, 5 kilometers away. You stand on a hill where, it seems, people did not live permanently, but where they kept coming back for some reason. At the same time, nearby there are signs of early processing of wild grains. Klaus Schmidt proposed an idea that once sounded almost heretical. Maybe farming did not create a center like this. Maybe the need to feed the people who built and maintained this center helped push nearby communities toward cultivating wild grains. Then comes a small but awkward complication. Yes, there is no beautiful river at the foot of Göbekli Tepe, and that once sounded almost like a final verdict: no water, no life. But on the plateau itself, archaeologists found channels cut into the rock, along with cisterns for rainwater. Not little ditches in the soil, not faint marks on the surface. Real gutters carved into stone, like the beds of tiny rivers. These channels were covered from above with cut limestone slabs, almost like modern storm drains beneath asphalt. Except here, everything was stone, made with flint, by human hands, for people to whom every line cut into the rock meant hard labor. And below the edge of the plateau, a cascade began. Pit-like reservoirs stood in steps. Rain gathered on the surface, moved into the channels, entered the first cistern, overflowed into the next, then farther down. A stone staircase for water. After a storm, every drop seemed to know its path, ending not in some random puddle, but in a reliable stone storage basin.
2 such cisterns were found northwest of Enclosure E, one of the ritual buildings. And the scale was not a little extra just in case. That stored water could have filled about 1,000 ordinary bathtubs. Archaeologists consider these structures among the oldest known systems for collecting drinking water. So the old formula is no longer quite so solid. A special place could very well have its own survival system. The field did not create the sanctuary. The sanctuary may have pushed people toward the field. Feel that reversal. Cause and effect change places. And there is a fact that gives this idea an entirely different lens. Not mythology, not a guess, genetics. In 1997, Manfred Hein's team collected hundreds of samples of the earliest wheat, einkorn, and compared their DNA. They used 288 molecular markers. In other words, they created something like a genetic fingerprint for the plant. And the trail turned out to be surprisingly precise. All modern domesticated varieties of einkorn, as it turned out, did not lead back to one enormous blurry zone, not to the entire Fertile Crescent at all once, but to one specific region, to the wild ancestor Triticum monococcum boeticum, which still grows on the slopes of Karakada in southeastern Turkey. And suddenly, the map tightens.
Karakada is not somewhere on the far side of the world. It is about 50 to 62 miles, 80 to 100 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe. By the scale of history, it is practically a neighboring hill, the same foothills, the same air of Upper Mesopotamia. Wild samples were taken from places such as the slopes west of Diyarbakir at about 4,600 feet, 1,400 meters, and east of Siverik at about 3,445 feet, 1,050 meters. So the epicenter of wheat domestication turned out to be close to the very place where hunter-gatherers were raising their stone circles. And here everything begins to come together, very quietly but very powerfully. Archaeology says early settlements and traces of a new life are appearing here. Genetics says grain is being domesticated here. And Göbekli Tepe stands between these worlds as a place of people who are still hunters, but already almost farmers. They were learning two things at once: how to gather around a sacred center and how to keep close the first grain that would later change the planet. So the main idea gains not only archaeological support, but DNA support as well. This is no longer just a beautiful theory. This turn can be traced in the genetic memory of the wheat people still eat today. The old version, first food, then meaning, starts to look harder and harder to defend here. Too much stone, labor, and symbolism appears earlier than that version can comfortably explain.
The workforce must have been enormous. Many ancient monuments were rebuilt over time, but Göbekli Tepe did this with almost obsessive persistence. Less than a century passes, and the builders fill in the first ring of pillars with earth, then raise a new one inside it or nearby. Then another. A few decades, another burial, another new structure. As if the place was not simply being built, but constantly renewed, restarted, and consecrated all over again. This was not a single burst of activity. It was a tradition, a memory held across generations. Beginning in the 9th millennium BC, the architecture changes. Instead of stone circles, rectangular structures appear. And what is especially strange is this. On average, the later buildings look simpler, rougher, and weaker in execution.
The most impressive monuments at Göbekli Tepe are the earliest ones. Layer by layer, the workmanship seems to become less refined. And then, around 8200 BC, the work stops. The people who came here for so many generations, who built, buried, and built again, stop. They leave, and they do not return. But before they disappear from memory, it is worth stepping inside those circles, because that is where it becomes clear why this place is so difficult to call an ordinary monument.
If you had come to Göbekli Tepe in its prime, one thing might have surprised you right away. The complex probably wasn't open to the sky the way it is today. Now the excavated circles stand under the sun, the wind, and the gaze of tourists. But archaeologists think these spaces may have once been covered by roofs. If so, it was dark inside, close, almost cave-like. Torchlight would have trembled across the stone as if it were alive. The air would have felt heavy. Smoke would have clung to the roof beams. Footsteps would have sounded muffled. And almost immediately, your eyes would have met the pillars. Each stone ring was made of limestone giants. Most were shaped like enormous T's. Low stone walls ran between them. At the center of nearly every circle stood the two largest pillars, taller, heavier, more important than the rest. The tallest reached more than 16 feet, 5 meters. For the technology of that age, that was almost a challenge thrown at the world. Some researchers think the sockets in the floor may not have been enough to keep them stable, and that the pillars may have been supported by wooden braces. When you imagine these paired central columns in the half-dark, it becomes clear why the first observers spoke not only of construction, they spoke as if something was there with you. An entire animal world is carved on the pillars. Boars, foxes, gazelles, lions, snakes, scorpions, birds, little ducks at the base of one pillar. Sometimes the images are almost schematic. Sometimes they're so powerful that you want to forget the date and ask, was this really made by a Stone Age person or by a time traveler? In the best carvings, you feel the hand of a master who understood form, movement, the tension of muscle, the predatory curve of a neck, the warning arc of a snake. This wasn't just scratching marks into stone, it made the stone feel alive.
And if you look more closely, it turns out this isn't just animal chaos. It isn't some random stone zoo where every craftsman carved whatever came to mind. There is a system. In building A, snakes appear again and again. In building B, foxes take the lead. In building C, boars seem to rule. And in building D, the eye keeps returning to birds, especially vultures. And then everything shifts slightly. Each building begins to look not just like a ring of pillars, but like a place gathered around its own animal, as if every structure had its own sign, its own emblem, its own ancient coat of arms, only not on cloth and not on a shield, but directly in stone. Archaeologist Olivier Dietrich has suggested exactly this. Perhaps these animals were something like totemic emblems for different groups. One clan may have built the place of the snake, another the place of the fox, a third the place of the boar, a fourth the place of the bird or the vulture. And that is a very different Göbekli Tepe. Not one shared temple where everyone worshipped in the same way, but a hill where different communities came together, each with its patron animal, its own memory, its own rituals. Maybe young men were initiated here into the adult world. Maybe stories were told about hunting dangerous animals. Maybe the very act of entering the circle was a symbolic descent into somewhere deeper, into a world of ancestors, death, power, and trial. And then the animals on the pillars stop being mere decoration. They become banners. Göbekli Tepe no longer looks like one voice. It looks like an entire network of voices. Not one shared prayer, but several worlds that came together for a time on the same hill.
With the birds, it's important not only to look at the stone, but also at the living world around the hill. Birds matter here not as a list of species, but as a key to the ritual calendar of the place. Because the birds on the pillars are only the stone part of the story, a sign, an emblem, an image. But around this hill, there was another bird world as well, living, noisy, seasonal, and it was far richer than it seems if you look only at the carvings. From bird bones at Göbekli Tepe and nearby sites in the upper Euphrates and Tigris region, researchers have counted at least 84 different kinds of birds. Not 4 or 5 familiar species, not simply they caught whatever happened to be flying nearby. 84 different traces in the material. There are corvids, crows and rooks, birds that stay close to people and carrion. There are partridges and bustards of the steppe, ducks tied to water in seasonal camps, cranes impossible to miss either in the sky or on the ground. There are vultures, eagles, falcons, birds of height, hunting and death. There are owls, nocturnal and quiet, belonging to a very different world. And here it's important not to turn this into a dull list of prey, because 84 different kinds is not a hunter's menu. It's almost a map of the sky, the steppe, the waters, and the migrations. Some birds arrived with the season, others lived nearby year-round. Some could be found by water, others on the open plain, others above slopes where vultures circle and where a person immediately understands something has died there. A duck points to water, a bustard points to open dry land, a crow speaks of nearby camps, bones, remains. An owl speaks of night, which also had to be known.
And one more thing. This part of Anatolia and Upper Mesopotamia lies directly on a major migration route. Twice a year, in spring and fall, the sky here truly became different. Flocks of cranes, storks, birds of prey riding warm currents of air. So 84 species is not only diversity, it is also the rhythm of the year, a rhythm people could hardly have missed. And this map tells us about more than birds. Today, the area around Göbekli is mostly dry hills, but in the early Holocene, 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, the climate here was noticeably wetter. Ducks and cranes in the bones are traces of other water, marshes, floods, seasonal lakes that no longer exist. Birds speak not only of the sky, but also of a land that is gone. And then there is the special case of the vulture. In Building D, the vulture appears again and again like a chief sign, and its bones are found in the material from the hill itself. So the bird was at the same time alive above the plain, prey in human hands, and an image on a pillar. The same vulture passed through all 3 worlds: sky, ritual, stone. And the vulture may not be accidental. On Göbekli Tepe's most famous relief, Pillar 43, a vulture is shown with a round object beside a headless human figure. And inside the buildings themselves, archaeologists have found human skulls with traces of ritual treatment. In this part of the world, the real vulture has always been a bird of the dead. It took what was left behind. And the stone vulture on the pillar most likely spoke of the same thing. Head, skull, body, sky. It was all one story.
So the people of Göbekli Tepe looked upwards no less carefully than they looked at the stone in front of them. They knew who arrived, who left, who stayed in pairs, who gathered in flocks, who hunted, who waited for carrion, who cried out at dawn, and who appeared only in darkness. For them, birds were not just background above their heads, they were part of the order of the world. And then Göbekli Tepe becomes wider still, not only a hill with pillars and animals on stone, a place where people read the sky as a landscape, where a bird was not just a bird, but a sign of season, water, death, road, height. Their world was larger than the familiar image of Stone Age hunters with spears. It stretched from the ground all the way to the sky. The clearest example is Pillar 27 in Enclosure C. There, a predator isn't merely scratched on the surface, it projects from the stone in high relief, almost like a three-dimensional sculpture. Below it, a boar appears in flatter form, and that makes the contrast between predator and prey even sharper. Imagine this without metal, without iron chisels, without anything like a familiar workshop. Only stone, flint, a human hand, and incredible persistence. After seeing that, the reliefs stop looking like decoration. They look like a language of force. So far, we've mostly been talking about the pillows that made it all the way, carved, separated from the bedrock, moved and set upright in the circle. But Göbekli Tepe also has something extremely important precisely because it failed.
On the western plateau lies an unfinished T-shaped pillar. Its length is about 23 feet, 7 meters. Its thickness is about 5 feet, 1.5 meters. So this was not a small blank, not a test piece, not a rough draft off to the side. It was a real large pillar, comparable to the ones that were meant to become part of the complex. But it was never separated from the living rock. And to me, this is one of the most honest traces of the entire labor, because a finished pillar already looks almost like a miracle. It stands, it has been worked, it has become part of the architecture. But here we see the moment before the miracle. The stone is still lying in the quarry. They had already begun to extract it from the rock. The shape had already been set. It was already clear what it was supposed to become. But at some point, the work stopped. One possible explanation is very earthly, a crack or natural flaw in the stone. The builders may have reached the stage where it became clear that if they continued, the monolith would simply split, and then all that labor would lose its meaning. Not because they didn't know how, not because they lacked the will, but because the material itself set a limit. And that matters. We often ask, how did they do this without metal? How could flint, hands, blows, and patience remove blocks like this?
The unfinished pillar answers not with words, but with its condition. It shows not the result, but the process. The stone is still being worked. The work has been interrupted. We see not only the technique, but the risk. Every strike could bring success closer, or it could reveal a defect after which continuing was no longer possible.
And then you begin to look differently at every standing pillar. Behind it, there is not just an idea and not just a ritual. There is a chain of stages, and every one of them had to go right. Choose the right stretch of rock, cut out the shape, separate the monolith, avoid breaking it, move it, raise it, set it in place. That 23-foot, 7-meter pillar on the western plateau remained at the beginning of that journey, a witness to effort and to the boundary even highly skilled builders could not always cross. In the fall of 2010, archaeologists found a sculpture in the wall of a rectangular room. It stood 76 inches tall, 192 centimeters, and was about 12 inches, 30 centimeters in diameter. It is built like a vertical story in 3 levels. At the top, a predator, perhaps a bear or a large cat. Below it, a human-like figure. Lower still, another figure and large snakes. This is more than a pillar or a sign. It is almost a stone story assembled into a body. These people knew how not only to place symbols, but to build scenes out of them. And here comes a discovery that changes not the plot, but the whole mood of the story. We are used to seeing Göbekli Tepe in grey T-shaped pillars, grey animals on stone, grey walls, grey benches, grey fragments. And it's easy to start thinking that this is what it always was, severe, stony, almost monochrome.
But in 2023, the German Archaeological Institute, the DAI, reported the discovery in Special Building D of a life-size limestone statue of a wild boar. According to the excavation team's preliminary report, the statue was about 4.4 feet long, 1.35 meters, and up to 2.3 feet high, 0.70 meters. Its date is early pre-pottery Neolithic B, roughly 8700 to 8200 BC, and its placement was not random. The boar stood on a stone bench between pillars 43 and 78, in front of pillar 67. In other words, not somewhere on the edge, not in a trash layer, not as an accidental fragment. It was built into the space of Building D itself, the very building where bird imagery is especially strong and where one of the most enigmatic scenes in all of Göbekli Tepe unfolds on Pillar 43. And now, the crucial part. On the surface of this statue, researchers documented traces of red, white, and black pigment. So this was not just a limestone boar, not just the grey figure we see today through the eyes of archaeology. It was painted. Its surface was meant to carry color. Red, white, black, not background shades of the stone, but traces of deliberate design. And that changes the feeling of the place in a powerful way. Because if the boar standing in the ritual scene of Building D was painted, then other elements may also have worked not only through form, but through color. Pillars, reliefs, walls, benches,
All of this may have been part of a much brighter visual environment than the one that has reached us.
There is another important nuance. Boars are usually associated with Building C, where they almost seem to be the main sign. But here, a boar appears in Building D among a different set of images. Birds, the vulture, a complex symbolic scene. So this may not be a simple emblem of one clan or one group. The boar may have been a character in a larger story. And then Göbekli Tepe stops being a place of grey stone. What we now see as weathered limestone may, during the life of the monument, have been a living painted scene, with red, white and black colour, with animals brought out into the space of the room, and with images that looked at people not like museum reliefs, but as part of a working ritual world. Almost all of these animals are dangerous, or at least imposing. Nothing tame, nothing pastoral or comforting. Before you is a world where nature presses, bites, stings, watches from the dark. The meaning of the images is still not fully clear. Are they guardians, totems, beings from myth? A terror people tried to tame, carve, bring out into the open? There is no single answer, but the choice of animals says a great deal. The people who created Göbekli Tepe did not carve a safe world, they carved a powerful one. There is another detail that once seen cannot be unseen. Where the sex of the animal can be identified, it is almost always male. Why this is, we don't know, but the pattern is too persistent to be accidental. The only female relief found so far belongs to a much later period. What we have before us is not simply a zoo in stone, but a very selected, very male set of symbols, as if this system of images emphasized aggression, strength, sexual energy, status, danger.
The excavation team has long thought that the T-shaped pillars may represent humans, not literally, not as realistic statues, but as highly stylized human figures. Some pillars have carved arms and hands. Some have something like loincloths. Some are strongly phallic. And if these pillars really are people, they have one striking feature. They have no heads. Powerful bodies, yes. Arms, yes. Signs of masculinity, yes, but no heads. At Göbekli Tepe, the pillars were not the only things that spoke. The passages spoke too. Archaeologists have found a special kind of stone there, porthole stones, slabs with a hole cut all the way through the center. These could be round or nearly rectangular openings set into a wall. In other words, the stone wasn't functioning as a separate sculpture, but part of the architecture. Through it, something opened. Beyond it, another space began. The most important example was found in 2011 in Building B, and it was found in situ, right in its original place, in the northern part of the structure, resting on the bedrock. In the middle of the slab was an opening roughly 16 to 20 inches wide, 40 to 50 centimeters. Not enormous, not a ceremonial gate, more like a narrow, controlled opening, one you could not pass through casually. On either side of it, 2 foxes were carved. They are arranged symmetrically, facing each other, as if frozen in a leap. They are not merely standing nearby, they seem to be lunging towards the center, towards the opening, towards the person approaching, or towards each other through the passage. And above the opening is a bucranium, a bull skull with horns.
The result is a strange and very precise composition. Below, the hole. On the sides, foxes. Above, the bull's head. The passage was not left empty. It was framed by animals. And this is not the only slab of its kind. On the northwestern hill of Göbekli Tepe, another porthole stone was found, this one almost monumental, about 10 by 10 feet, 3 by 3 meters. It was not lying in its original place, so we don't know exactly where it once stood, but the stone itself speaks loudly enough. It has not one opening like the other known slabs, but two, and around them are reliefs in high projection: a bull, a ram, a wild cat, and a long snake about 5 feet long, 1.5 meters. This is no longer just a decorated edge. It is an entire animal boundary. Archaeologists from the DAI carefully explain these slabs as architectural openings, entrances into buildings, or perhaps passages to special niches inside rooms. The important thing is not to turn this into a confident story about soul windows or Seelenloch, as sometimes happens in popular writing about megaliths. For Göbekli Tepe, that interpretation is not the DAI's working position. It is safer here to speak of a threshold, a place of transition. And then the meaning becomes stronger. To enter such a building meant more than stepping across a stone boundary. You had to pass through a sign, through an opening guarded by foxes, beneath a bull's skull, or past a bull, a ram, a wild cat, and a long snake about 5 feet long. The act of entry itself became ritual. The stone did not simply divide space into outside and inside. It placed the person face to face with the animal emblem, and only then allowed them farther in.
And there is something at Göbekli that is especially hard to fit inside the mind. After pillars, animal signs, skulls, suddenly faces appear. Not faces on a statue, not a face on a pillar, actual stone masks. 3 have been found, and the strangest thing is that they seem to exist at 3 different scales. The first is large, about 16.5 inches, larger than an ordinary human face. You couldn't wear it. It is too big, too heavy, too stone. Most likely, it hung on a wall or was fixed to some kind of support, like a face that watched what was happening on its own. The second is completely different, small, just under 2.4 inches, fitting in the palm of a hand, made of limestone, concave on the back as if it really were a mask, only reduced to the size of a personal object. The features are almost as simple as they can be, very few lines, very few details, but the face is still immediately readable. And there is a third, smaller still, about 1.8 inches. It is engraved on flint cortex, the rough outer surface of a piece of flint. A tiny face on stone, but the eyes are more strongly expressed. And it was found not just anywhere, but by the eastern central pillar of enclosure C. And that small object immediately changes the scale of the conversation. It means Göbekli had not only enormous stone images, people here also knew how to make portable faces. A face could be large for a wall, small for the hand,
tiny as a sign carved into stone. Laura Dietrich and her colleagues connect these masks with rituals in which myths related to death were reenacted, and that greatly changes the feeling of the place. A mask is not merely an ornament, it is an object through which a person stops being only himself. He enters the ritual as someone else, an ancestor, a spirit, the dead, a predator, a story. So ritual did not remain only in the stone geometry of the hill. A face could be shown.
Worn, miniaturized, carried away, and then Göbekli Tepe is no longer simply a sanctuary. It is a stage where, for a time, a person could become something else. And after the stone heads, after the small masks, after all those hints of the face as something separate, Göbekli Tepe gives us not an image, not a sign, not a carving, but actual human skulls. This matters because here we leave the realm of maybe they thought this way and enter the realm of bone. Something you can place on a table, examine under magnification, and measure in fractions of an inch. At Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists found 691 fragments of human bone, and 408 of them belong to the skull. So this isn't a case where one stray human bone happened to turn up somewhere in the debris. There are many skull fragments, and among them are 7 fragments belonging to at least 3 adult individuals, treated in an unusual way. These skulls have deep artificial grooves cut into them. The grooves run along the sagittal axis, roughly along the top line of the skull, from front to back. They are not tiny random scratches, not traces left because a tool accidentally scraped the bone. They are deliberate, visible, repeated cuts. And one of these skulls also has a hole. Here's the key detail. On the so-called Skull 1, the hole was drilled through the parietal bone, and it was drilled from the outside inward. The outer diameter is 0.26 inches. The inner diameter is 0.20 inches. Those are very dry numbers, but that is exactly where the power of the find sits. Because when you have the direction of drilling, the diameter, the position of the hole, and the grooves across the top, you can no longer say only the skull was somehow damaged. You can begin, carefully, to reconstruct an action. The authors of the study believe the hole may have allowed the skull to be hung vertically, not randomly, not sideways, not with the back of the head pointing down, but so that it faced forward. And the grooves may have held a cord in place, keeping it from slipping across the smooth surface of the bone. Imagine not a scene, but the object itself. The skull of an adult human being, lines cut into it, a hole drilled through the bone. A cord may have passed through that hole, and the whole arrangement was likely designed so the head would hang facing the viewer. That is an entirely different level of conversation. Because sometimes when people say skull cult, it can sound as if archaeologists simply like dramatic phrases. They found a skull, so now it must be a cult. But here, the point is not the word. The point is that the bone was deliberately altered. It was not merely separated from the body. It was not merely cleaned. It was prepared for some further use. And the researchers stress this directly. These marks do not look like ordinary defleshing. When soft tissue is removed from a skull, it leaves certain kinds of cuts. This is different. Deep, lengthwise grooves, drilling, the placement of the marks, all of this looks like a separate category of skull treatment. And this particular form had not previously been known from the Neolithic Near East. So Göbekli Tepe does something strange again. In one sense, it fits into the broader world of the early Neolithic, where human skulls really could be kept, modified, displayed, and reburied. But at the same time, it does it in its own way, not simply like the neighbors, but through some distinct local practice. And this isn't an isolated oddity.
Within the monument itself, the theme of the separated or special head appears again and again. On Pillar 43, there is a headless human figure with a clearly erect male body. A human statue about 24 inches tall was found with its head deliberately broken off. There is a small figure, the so-called gift-bearer, about 10 inches tall, holding a human head in his hands. And alongside these are images of predators and birds of prey, where motifs of severed heads may also be present. And when you gather all of this together, it no longer feels like a set of accidents. Stone figures without heads, masks that seem to preserve the face apart from the body, a human being carrying a head in his hands, birds of prey and wild animals near dead or separated heads, and real human skulls marked with grooves and a hole for suspension. Here, the head was not just a part of the body. It may have been a separate vessel of someone's lingering presence, perhaps of memory, perhaps of power, perhaps of connection with the dead. We do not have to invent an exact explanation right away, because we do not have their words. But we do have the bone, and the bone speaks clearly enough. Something was being done with human skulls here, deliberately, not metaphorically, not as a pretty idea about the head and the face, but with hands, with tools, on actual human bone. And because of that, the head motif at Göbekli Tepe becomes much harder to dismiss. It stops being only a symbol carved in stone. It becomes a practice that left a physical trace, a cut line, a drilled hole, a skull that may once have hung upright, facing forward.
There are many bones here, mostly gazelle bones, but also bones from aurochs, wild cattle, birds, and other animals. There are so many that the idea of large feasts no longer sounds like a beautiful fantasy. It sounds like a serious working conclusion. Feasts, sacrifices, seasonal gatherings, mass meals. A place where people came not to live, but to do something together. But feasts are not only bones and meat. At Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists found 7,268 grinding tools, including about 3,000 hand stones. For such an early period, the density is enormous. About 2 tools for 35 cubic feet of deposit. Some of these stones seem to have been used for fine flour, others for softer grains or malt. Researchers are careful in how they phrase it. Perhaps people here prepared not only porridge and bread mixtures, but also something like malt for drinks. Not beer is proven, but large-scale grain processing beside ritual gatherings already looks by itself like the setting of a major festival. And with those grinding tools came one more thing, without which the picture does not quite come together. More than 600 stone vessels were found at Göbekli Tepe, and one group stands out in particular. Large stone troughs, almost like tubs. Some are more than 1.5 feet across. Some reach more than 3 feet. Not a bowl, not a pot, not a neat cup for one person. These are containers into which you could pour several ordinary buckets of water, add grain, stir it, heat it, and produce food for many people at once.
They were made of limestone. They were shaped with hammers, chisels, and hard stones. In effect, they are rough, heavy, hewn stone tubs. And the most important thing here is not even their size. They were not portable dishes. They were not placed on the floor and then carried away. These troughs were built directly into the interiors of rectangular and apsidal buildings, into the walls, into the floors, into the layout of the room itself. This is no longer bring it in, take it away. It is part of the room, like a stove in an old house, a stone place for preparing food, designed for mixing, cooking, distributing, perhaps again and again. And archaeologists, led by Laura Dietrich, tried to test how this might have worked in practice. They took malt, ground it roughly, mixed it with water, and heated it. A small team, literally 2, 3, or 4 people, could produce a thick grain porridge in an ordinary working day. And if the remains of that mixture were left for another 5 days, the liquid began to ferment on its own. The result was a weak beer-like drink at about 2% alcohol. Not strong beer in the modern sense, more like a light, sour, grain-based brew. And the key point is this: the experiment showed that all of it could be done quite easily by a small group of people. So, the ritual at Göbekli Tepe begins to smell not only of smoke, stone, and blood of butchered animals. It smells of hot malt, boiled grain, heavy, wet porridge, a slightly sour, intoxicating drink sitting in a stone trough, slowly fermenting. And the scene of the feast suddenly stops being abstract. It becomes almost physical. Stone tubs inside rooms, flour, malt, water, fire, people gathered around, and food prepared not for one person, but for an assembly. And the question becomes sharper. For what? For what idea did hundreds of people drag stones, carve limestone, feed workers, and return here generation after generation? The most common and cautious theory says that Göbekli Tepe was an ancient religious center. The lack of permanent housing and water makes year-round settlement unlikely, but it fits well with the image of a special place people visited at certain times for festivals, rituals, sacrificial feasts, community meetings, alliance-making, choosing marriage partners, seasonal ceremonies. It is not a city in our sense. It is a point of attraction, a sacred stage. This idea is also supported by the fact that Göbekli Tepe had younger relatives. Within a radius of about 125 miles, archaeologists have found settlements with similar pillars and related imagery, only on a smaller scale. Klaus Schmidt offered a vivid metaphor.
These places may have been like village churches of one long-vanished religion, while Göbekli Tepe was its cathedral. Because of the animal imagery, some have also suggested that the system was connected with animism, the idea that animals, objects, and natural forces contain a special spiritual essence. Against the background of the grooved skulls we have already described, the hypothesis of a head cult stops being decorative. It becomes a real working possibility. In that case, the headless human pillars no longer look like a random oddity. They look like part of the same logic, as if the head here was a separate and special carrier of power. There is also an astronomical theory, though the current excavation team does not accept it as the main explanation. According to one version, some pillars may have marked the rising of Sirius at different points in time. This is intriguing because at this latitude, Sirius became visible again around 9300 BC. For people who watched the sky carefully, the appearance of a new bright star may have been an event powerful enough to inspire new rituals.
Others go further. They see constellations in the animals carved on the pillars, and in the famous Pillar 43, a memory of a comet impact and a catastrophe connected with the younger Dryas. That pillar really does contain a set of images that different researchers have tried to read as a sky map. Nearby is a headless human figure, sometimes interpreted as a symbol of mass death. But here it is important not to slip into mockery and not into excessive certainty either. We do not know for sure whether there was a comet impact in exactly the form described by supporters of that theory. We do not know whether the builders worshipped skulls, Sirius, animals, ancestors, gods, the sky, or all of these at once in some complex blend. We have traces, analogies, careful conclusions. But even that is already almost a miracle. Then the story changes genre. It becomes not only archaeology, but a detective story about how one of the greatest discoveries could have been missed from only a few steps away. When construction at Göbekli Tepe stopped around 8200 BC, Sumer was still 4,000 years in the future. So when we say the place was lost, this is not the soft tourist version of the word lost. It truly disappeared. It fell out of memory so completely that it became nothing more than a strange hill. Millennia passed, languages, peoples, and empires changed. Animals grazed over the mound, people dug the soil and built their lives nearby. Almost no one suspected that beneath their feet lay one of the great turning points in human history. In 1963, archaeologists from the University of Chicago surveyed southeastern Turkey and stopped at Göbekli Tepe. They decided it was essentially an old Byzantine military post with perhaps a medieval cemetery on top. Few dry lines about the hill remained in the report. Sometimes history lies directly in front of you, and you walk past it simply because you have not yet learned how to see.
Klaus Schmidt came to this place by his own path. In 1983, the young German archaeologist arrived in Turkey to work at Nivali Chori, a Neolithic site being urgently investigated before it was flooded by the waters of the Ataturk Dam. Nevali Chori was already an extraordinary place in its own right. Pre-pottery Neolithic, terrazzo floors, early architectural forms, stone sculpture, hints of a complex ritual world. There he learned to see an age in which stone was not yet simply stone. When the waters finally swallowed Nevali Chori in 1991, he stayed in Turkey. He traveled through the region, took part in small excavations, read old reports. At some point, he came across those dull lines about Potbelly Hill. In 1994, he climbed Göbekli Tepe and almost immediately understood. This was not some minor Byzantine leftover. Flint flakes were lying everywhere. There were so many that a trained eye instantly saw a Stone Age working area. For someone who had passed through Nevali Chori, it was almost electric. Schmidt convinced the German Archaeological Institute to fund excavations. In 1995, the team began work. Beneath just a few inches of soil, the tops of stone pillars appeared. Then a whole ring, then another. Very quickly, it became clear they had not simply found a new site. They had found something capable of rewriting a chapter in the beginning of civilization. Other important figures were connected with Schmidt's work. His mentor, Harold Hauptmann, Turkish archaeologists, the landowners. People argued with him. Not everyone liked his theories, but he recorded what he found, and step by step he opened a door into a past more than 10,000 years deep. In 2014, Schmidt died. He had discovered a place that had survived 11,600 years, but he did not see the full scale of what he had brought out of the earth.
Göbekli Tepe is not a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It belongs to an entire world of the pre-pottery Neolithic in Upper Mesopotamia. Nevali Chori, Chayuni, Kortik Tepe, Karahan Tepe, other places. The region was alive with experiments in architecture, ritual, settled life, and new forms of living together. But even against that background, Göbekli Tepe stands apart. Scale, early date, ambition, artistic boldness. If you step a little farther back from the hill, the picture becomes even more interesting. The glaciers retreat. The southern slopes of the Taurus Mountains grow green. River valleys fill with life. Oak and pistachio forests expand. Wild boar, gazelles, aurochs, goats, and birds move through the open spaces. For the people of the late Paleolithic, this must have felt like a new generosity in the world. Not just it got warmer, more as if the earth itself had opened. And when there are more resources, culture can grow not only out of hunger, but out of abundance. We are too used to thinking that great art, religion, and social complexity are born only as a response to scarcity, but they can also be born as a response to plenty. When you have extra energy, you do not invest it only in survival. You invest it in meaning, memory, form, myth, a place where people gather not because disaster has cornered them, but because they need something larger than getting through one more day. The Younger Dryas, the cold period around 10,800 BC, also plays a role here. Some theorists believe this climatic shock pushed communities towards new strategies, staying closer to water, tightening control over food, experimenting with sowing and tending plants. Others emphasize that the decisive factor was not hunger, but already existing cultural complexity, the desire to gather, celebrate, bury the dead, honor ancestors, and build shared places of power. The real story was clearly more complicated than a simple either-or. Climate, resources, ritual, prestige, fear, hope, power. All of it could have been working at once.
The Natufians of the Levant show very well that the revolution began not only in technology, but in the mind. They still lived in many ways as hunter-gatherers, but they were already burying their dead in specific places, creating stable settlements, making art, and strengthening their bond with land and memory. It is not only the diet that changes first, the image of the world changes. And Göbekli Tepe rises as an extreme, almost dazzling point in that process. Not a farm from which ritual grew, but a ritual that may itself have accelerated the appearance of new forms of economy and social structure. One simple thought especially stays with me. How many things had to come together for Göbekli Tepe to appear at all? There had to be a landscape rich in resources, groups willing to cooperate, a mythology that justified that kind of labor, craftspeople who knew how to carve stone, people willing to return to the same place again and again. Now turn the question around. How many things had to come together for us to learn about it today? The hill had to survive without being cut down to its base. It had to avoid destruction by farming and construction. Someone in 1963 had to at least mention it in a report. Klaus Schmidt had to read those boring lines. His experience at Navali Chori had to teach him to see the Neolithic where others saw only debris and stones. And in 1995, a few inches of soil had to give up the first tops of the pillars. That is why Göbekli Tepe has such a hold on the imagination. Not only because it is very old, age alone does not make a thing feel alive, but because here you sense another human mind at the edge of time. You look at the pillars, the foxes, the snakes, the headless stone people, the bones left after feasts, the rings that were buried and rebuilt, and you understand, these were not pre-primitive people who accidentally stacked a few large stones. This was a society that already knew how to gather around an idea.
Already knew how to make the sacred visible. Already knew how to turn space into memory. And then the main question is no longer about the stones. The main question is what inside the human being learned to gather other people around the invisible. Göbekli Tepe doesn't hang in empty space. Recent finds only make that clearer. At Sai Burç, not far from Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists found a relief from the 9th millennium BC that looks almost like one of the oldest stone scenes ever made. 5 figures on a bench, a man in high relief, 2 leopards with open jaws, another man in profile holding a snake or rattle, and a bull with enormous horns. Archaeologist Eylem Özdoğan calls it one of the earliest known narrative scenes. Near Potbelly Hill, we no longer see a single isolated symbol. We see a whole region learning how to tell stories in stone. Göbekli Tepe stands within the landscape around Şanlıurfa, where related sites were later found. Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Hamzan Tepe, Tashli Tepe, Çakmak Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepesi, and other points in the so-called Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills landscape. Once nearby monuments with a similar logic begin to appear, Göbekli Tepe stops being an anomaly. It becomes a window into an entire cultural universe we had failed to see for far too long. The problem is no longer that there was one strange hill. The problem is that the whole region was strange. We were simply looking past it. Nevali Chori matters a great deal here. It also had T-shaped elements, complex symbolism, and early ritual structures. Then modernity intervened. Dams, vast water management projects, the reshaping of the landscape. Archaeology often had to race against time. Some places were uncovered, others disappeared underwater. Some meanings came into view, others vanished beneath a new layer of reality. We are trying to understand the birth of complex society, while we ourselves are reshaping the earth with bulldozers.
Beginning in 1995, the world slowly started to grasp the scale of what was happening. First, one circle, then another, then pillars, reliefs, dates, then a new and almost uncomfortable conclusion. All of this really did belong to an incredibly early time, not to the age of developed cities, not to later states, but to a moment when, according to the old model, all of this should still have been far away, and yet it was already there. Add to that an almost mathematical blow. Researchers Gil Hackley and Avi Goffer noticed that 3 enclosures, B, C, and D, form an almost equilateral triangle, each side about 63 feet, 19.25 meters long. The error is less than 1.5%. For the Stone Age, that doesn't sound like they put things wherever they could. It sounds like a plan, like a single architectural concept someone held in mind and passed on to others. After that, there is simply nowhere left to put the word primitive. It is hard to speak dryly about Göbekli Tepe. The central pairs of pillars in many enclosures seem to create a kind of stage. Around them, the other elements form a circle of witnesses. This does not feel like housing. It feels like a place of action, an architecture of presence, a stone drama in which every participant knows where to look. The hill rises above the surrounding land. From here, the views open out in every direction. The landscape is not just a backdrop, it works together with the monument. Wind, dry grass, light, the distant horizon. Somewhere below, herds move, people move, seasons move, roots move, life moves. And up above, someone raises a stone, carves a fox on the surface of a pillar, cuts a line meant to outlive him.
Some researchers see Göbekli Tepe primarily as a ritual center. Others are more cautious. The divide between ritual and ordinary life may be too modern for a society this early. For the people of that time, the world was probably not split into our convenient boxes. Here is religion, here is politics, here is economics, here is art. Hunting, memory, death, seasonal gatherings, exchange, food, status, myth, fear of the animal world, ancestors, the body, the earth, the sky,
all of it may have been bound together. But even without later labels, one thing is obvious. Meaning was concentrated here, too concentrated to reduce it to just a place where people lived. Another troubling layer has to do with food. Around Göbekli Tepe and across the region, there is evidence that local groups were actively working with wild grains long before fully developed agriculture. That does not mean they were farmers in the familiar sense, but the boundary between gathering plants and controlling them was alive and shifting. If large groups of people came here regularly, they had to be fed. If they had to be fed, the price of coordination rose. And if the price of coordination rose, the temptation grew to stabilize the food supply. In that way, ritual may have pulled the economy behind it. You expect the village to come first and the temple later. But here, temple-like architecture seems to pull the village after it, not literally the next day, but as historical pressure, as necessity, as an answer to a new form of collective life. The T-shaped pillars repeat. That means system, not one craftsman's private fantasy, not a random decorative trick. This was an image someone considered important enough to reproduce again and again. Repetition in things like this almost always means a stable code, a shared language, something understood not by two people but by many. Before us are people with abstraction, with a plan, with an image, with a collective imagination.
And collective imagination is one of the most powerful technologies in history. States stand on it. Money stands on it. Religions, empires, laws stand on it. Perhaps on the hill of Göbekli Tepe, we are seeing one of the earliest material traces of a human group learning to believe in something shared so strongly that it could organize masses of bodies, time, and labor around that belief. Not through text, not through chronicles, not through the decree of a king, through stone, through form, through repetition, through a place you had to come to. That is why the question of who built Göbekli Tepe matters so much. As soon as you say hunter-gatherers, the mind automatically shrinks the scale. But here we have to expand the meaning of the term itself. Yes, these were communities without later urban infrastructure. Yes, they lived differently. Yes, their economy was not state agriculture. But it does not follow that they were socially simple. It does not follow that they could not coordinate. It does not follow that they lacked complex rituals, hierarchies, traditions, role distribution, skill, knowledge transfer, and large collective projects. Perhaps we have spent too long confusing the absence of writing with the absence of complexity. Göbekli Tepe forces us to rethink that. It also punishes us for our arrogance toward the ancient world. Human development was not a smooth staircase where every step had to follow neatly from the one before it. History lurched, experimented, assembled forms, lost them, invented them again. And at some point, on the top of a hill in southeastern Turkey, a complex appeared whose very idea was older than many of our usual explanations. As of 2021, only about 5% of the site had been excavated. 95% still remained underground. We argue about the meaning of Göbekli Tepe only with a tiny part of the whole body in front of us. We see the tip of the iceberg and already understand that it breaks the map. but the iceberg itself remains hidden in the dark. How many more circles are there? How many reliefs? How many building phases? How many traces that will change the picture once again? Even now, after films have been made about Göbekli Tepe, books have been written, and hundreds of discussions have taken place, we are still at the beginning of understanding it. That matters when someone tries to turn the site into a ready-made slogan. Some want to make it proof of whatever theory suits them. Others try to force it back into the old framework. But reality is probably more complicated than either extreme. Göbekli Tepe does not need a cheap sensation. It makes us admit that ancient peoples were both unlike us and far closer to us in depth of mind than we long wanted to believe. What if people were gathered not by houses but by stories? What if the first great glue of society was not economic but symbolic? What if the desire to stand together before something shared, frightening, sacred, and binding was stronger than we thought? Then much of human history looks different. Then the temple did not grow as an ornament of abundance. It may have been an engine of cooperation. Shared myths, shared rituals, shared places of memory were not a superstructure placed on top of material life. They were among the main machines that reshaped that life.
Göbekli Tepe stands exactly on that boundary, between hunting and farming, between movement and settlement, between the gesture of survival and the gesture of meaning, between body and myth. That is why this hill is so hard to explain and so easy to feel, even if you do not are an archaeologist, even if you do not remember the dates. People gathered, raised stone, gave it form, filled that form with animals, signs, presents, returned, repeated, closed it over, built again. And they did this in a world only just emerging from the icy spasm of the Younger Dryas. We like to think complexity begins where tablets appear, where accounting appears, where city walls rise, where royal names are written down. But Göbekli Tepe reminds us the first thing is not the record. The first thing is the ability of many people to gather around a shared idea, not only around food, not only around a chief, but around something that cannot be seen or touched. If that idea is powerful enough, it begins to move stone. Everything else comes later. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe is not just an ancient sanctuary. It is a place where the mechanism is almost bare. People believe in something shared, gather for it, and then drag stone. That is why it is so unsettling. It shows not only the past, it shows a mechanism that still lives inside us. People still gather around shared symbols. They still build enormous systems for things they cannot hold in their hands: faith, identity, memory, fear, promise, belonging. Only the material has changed. Back then, it was limestone on a hill. Today, it may be cities, states, networks, ideologies, screens, but the inner engine is recognizable.
First, a shared image, then shared labor, then a new shape of the world. But Göbekli Tepe did not invent symbolic life from nothing. To see its roots, we have to take one short step back into Paleolithic Europe, tens of thousands of years before this hill. Things like this do not fall from the sky. Somewhere, human beings had already begun learning to see the world as more than food, danger, and paths. We are used to a simple model: settlement, economy, surplus, priests, temples, symbols, complex rituals. But the chain breaks. Things usually tied to the larger process of Neolithization begin earlier, still in the world of hunter-gatherers, still before full villages, still before fields. Take Dolní Věstonice, a Paleolithic site in Moravia, in the modern Czech Republic, about 20,000 years older than Göbekli Tepe. Even there, archaeologists found not just traces of daily life, but a complex symbolic world. Burials, figurines, early ceramics, objects that clearly functioned as more than tools. One image is especially gripping. A woman of about 40, almost completely covered in ochre, placed near a mammoth bone and a fox. She had a noticeable congenital facial deformity, and at the same site a figurine was found with similar features. We do not know whether she was a shaman, an elder, a person of special memory, but one thing is clear: these were not simple hunters who merely froze, ate, and survived. These were people already able to turn body, death, and image into story.
Dolní Věstonice does not take the stage away from Göbekli Tepe. It shows the depth of the roots. The sacred, the symbolic, and the collective did not suddenly appear on Potbelly Hill. Göbekli Tepe raised that ancient human capacity to a new, stone, almost impossible scale. In other late Paleolithic and early Neolithic communities, we also find things that for too long seemed impossible for hunter-gatherers: long-distance connections, exchange, extravagant expenditure, special places, seasonal gathering centers, ritual actions. The world was mobile but not primitive, flexible but not simple. Especially important are images of beings that do not fit our usual categories: half human, half animal, a creature on the boundary. Where the modern eye wants to see fantasy, ancient people may have seen the structure of reality. One of the most powerful examples was found in Germany in 1939. It is the famous figurine from Hohenstein-Stadel, about 41,000 years old, the Lion Man. Not simply an animal, and not simply a human, but a being assembled from two orders of existence at once. It appears not in a late civilization, not in a temple state, not after thousands of years of farming, but almost at the very beginning of the Upper Paleolithic. A similar logic appears elsewhere. At Star Car in North Yorkshire, red deer skulls were found modified in ways that suggest they were worn on the head. In French caves, there is the famous image usually called the sorcerer, half human, half animal. Again, a crack between categories. The human being does not merely observe the animal, he crosses the boundary, enters it, wears it, becomes it, at least for a time.
This is a long line. Long before Göbekli Tepe, the human imagination already held a world where the borders between human, animal, spirit, and image were far more comfortable than we find comfortable. Not in abstraction, but in practice. Masks, bodily ritual, figures, drawings, scenes. David Graeber and David Wengrow in The Dawn of Everything directly attacked the old model in which hunter-gatherers must be small, equal, simple, and politically naive. The material suggests the opposite. Some such societies could gather in large seasonal centers, hold complex ceremonies, and reshape the social order depending on the time of year. And if that is true, the Haran plain near the future Göbekli Tepe no longer looks like an empty backdrop. It begins to look like a stage for large assemblies. Imagine it. Groups of hunter-gatherers scattered for much of the year, converging on special places. Not forever, not necessarily in full settlement, but regularly. With memory of place, with obligations, with expectation. They came there not only to exchange things, but to exchange worlds, rituals, songs, stories, bodies, alliances. Within the Stone Hills culture, we also need to look at the sister sites. Above all, Nevali Chori. There, archaeologists found an unusually rich set of artifacts. One rare engraved stone basin built into the floor of a house was tentatively interpreted as a sacrificial altar. A central figure is carved on it. At first, it was interpreted as a turtle. Later, the view shifted. Perhaps it is a woman dancing. The legs point downward. The arms are raised toward the sky. If so, we may be looking at one of the earliest dance scenes in human history. And dance, almost everywhere, is tied to festival and religious activity.
If we dig deeper, sound also emerges. Ritual sound, noise, hum, scrape, rotation. Bull rowers, clappers, rattles, scrapers. Such things are known in many traditional societies. They do not work as music in the modern sense, but as a technology for changing states of mind. They frighten, mesmerize, dislodge, pull people into rhythm, erase ordinary speech, create the sense that something other is present. Then the space of Göbekli Tepe begins to be heard, not only seen. Stone circles, shadows, hides, smoke, masked figures, people entering the role of animals. Sound moving over stone, scraping over bone, a sharp strike, a low vibration traveling through the air. This is no longer a museum diagram. It is almost a stage, almost night, almost the breath of something unfamiliar nearby. Anthropologist Brian Hayden developed the idea of competitive feasting. In his view, large-scale feasts may have driven social complexity long before states. Leaders gather people, provide excessive food, display generosity, buy allies, fix debts, build reputation. At some point, the feast stops being a side element of ritual and becomes its motor. But feasts do not have to be competitive. The opposite may also have been normal. Egalitarian feasting, designed to restrain inequality hierarchies and enforce the obligation to share food. The same feast can work in both directions. It can bind equality or grow power. Whatever the mechanism, one thing is clear. Once societies learned to organize their members effectively, they gained an enormous advantage. A large gathering requires food, coordination, labor, place.
That means it creates pressure on production and on social organization. An economy can begin to spin around a ritual center. A new kind of world can gather around a major event.
In the 2000s, this became especially important in debates over the origins of agriculture. Older models, including Gordon Child's oasis theory, linked the shift to food production mainly to environmental pressure, drought, and the crowding of people and animals into oasis zones. It was a powerful model, but it explained too much through environment and too little through symbolic upheaval. Jacques Cauvin proposed looking differently, not only at grain and climate, but at a revolution of symbols, at a change in images of the world, at the way human beings saw themselves and everything around them. In The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, Cauvin argued that religious and symbolic transformation may not have followed economic change, but preceded it. The chronology matters. The symbolic overturn begins already between the 13th and 10th millennium BC, before agriculture had fully taken shape in the familiar sense. Grain did not create the gods. Perhaps the gods helped create grain, not in a mythological sense, but in a social one, a practical one, in the sense of a new form of collective action. Here we meet the uncomfortable question Colin Renfrew called the sapient paradox, the puzzle of why humans with modern brains took so long to build monuments and complex societies. Homo sapiens has existed for hundreds of thousands of years. The brain is already there. Speech is already there. But grand symbolic systems, monumental ritual spaces, and new regimes of social organization erupt late. Why?
Part of the answer lies in environment, resources, and the accumulation of economic practices. But that is not enough. Even ideal conditions do not build themselves into stone circles. They do not carve animals into T-shaped pillars. They do not make hundreds of people come to one place for something they cannot eat or carry home. Another answer has to do with religion as a social force. Anthropologists have long shown that the sacred is not a surface decoration on human life. It gathers the collective. It tears a person out of everyday time. It makes a place different. It calls up awe before something larger than yourself. That feeling is not decorative, it is social and bodily. You come to a special place and stop being simply yourself. You become part of a scene you do not fully control. Powerful rituals do not explain the world, they produce it. Bring that back into the landscape of Upper Mesopotamia, into stone, into dust, into the early Neolithic. Before you is not a group of practical people who one day decided to build something strange. Before you is a society already trained by millennia of images, masks, passages, collective actions, feasts, gatherings, ritual sounds, and seasonal centers. Göbekli Tepe does not fall from the sky. It grows out of long memory.
That memory is visible in later complexes as well, for example at Chayunu. There, archaeologists found special buildings that clearly break out of ordinary domestic logic. There are traces of collective practices, structures linked to the body, the treatment of remains, repeated actions. At the so-called skull building or blood altar, ritual human sacrifice may have taken place. This does not prove a direct connection with Göbekli Tepe, but it does show the darker side of the region's ritual world.
Ritual architecture does not suddenly appear in a fully formed civilization. It grows gradually, but it grows stubbornly. From there, the line continues into Mesopotamia. By the 4th millennium BC, cosmology, power, and economy are already locked into a single mechanism. By the 3rd millennium BC, the Sumerian world has complex pantheons, systems of distribution, and temple institutions. This is the later, formal version of something that had once been rougher, darker, more bodily. But the roots go deeper, back to where there is still no city in the full sense, but there is already a special place, a center, a repeated collective form. The biblical Eden sometimes appears here as a cultural footnote. Eastern Anatolia fits temptingly with ancient ideas about a land of origins, rivers, the beginning of human history. But that is exactly what it is, a footnote, not proof. The real center is held not by later texts and beautiful coincidences, but stones, bones, dates, reliefs, and a regional context that is slowly emerging from the ground. If we take this long prehistory seriously, much begins to fit together. Half-animal figures, masks, transformations, seasonal gatherings, feasts, ritual sounds, special buildings, a symbolic overturn before an economic one. These are not separate curiosities. They are one funnel, slowly drawing people toward the threshold of a new world.
Perhaps that is why the stones of Göbekli Tepe still feel so heavy today. They do not stand at the beginning of religion, and they do not stand at the beginning of civilization. They stand at a point of transition, where the old hunter-gatherer world reaches maximum density and almost no longer fits inside itself, where ritual expands to the scale of architecture, where image demands space, where the gathering of people demands a new kind of organization, where the sacred begins to change the economy, not the other way around. The question is no longer whether these people were advanced enough for such a structure. The question is different. What exactly were they doing there that made it worth returning to this hill again and again, dragging stone, carving reliefs, creating circles, and then burying them? If one line runs from the Lion Man to Navali Chore, from ritual masks to feasts, then Göbekli Tepe is not simply a strange monument. It is the moment when human imagination became too large for the old form of life. The field does not change first. The world inside the mind changes first. What a person freezes before, what he fears, what he enters, what he hears in the hum of a night ritual. And if the symbolic explosion really did come before the economic one, if ritual could gather people before agriculture, then Göbekli Tepe was not the result of a new world. It helped create that world.
After all of this, you stand again before the old question. What do we really have left apart from stories? If we gather the chain without a safe distance, it sounds almost overwhelming. From the gazelle herds of the Haran plain to feasts beneath monoliths, from the possible dancing woman on the stone basin at Navali Chore to bull rowers, clappers and scrapers, from Dolny Vestonice to Saibuch, from Chayanu to fear, sacrifice and hope, from Corvin, Hayden, Graber and Wengro to the land itself around Shanliurfa. In all of this, Göbekli Tepe no longer looks like an anomaly accidentally sticking out of the ground. It looks like a knot, a place where many ancient threads suddenly tighten together. Not into one simple answer that matters. There is no single button that starts civilization. It was not that someone simply calculated economic benefit and built a world. More likely, human beings first experienced shock, awe, fear, ecstasy, the desire to gather, the desire to repeat, the desire to fix this place in memory, to make it a center. Only then did new discipline, new roles, new forms of power, and new ways of getting and sharing food begin to grow around it. The final loop closes not around stone, it closes around the human being. Because this whole story is not only about how people hunted, built, or buried, it is about how people learned to feel the world together. How they turned terror before nature into ritual, loneliness into procession, the sound of the wind into music, death into memory, surplus food into a feast into an alliance into order, and order sometimes into inequality, sometimes into hope, sometimes into myth.
When the circles of Göbekli Tepe were filled in with earth, more than stones disappeared. One way of being human was closed, one way of gathering, one way of looking at the sky, animals, ancestors, and themselves. But it did not vanish without a trace. It settled into other rituals, mountains, names, deities, stories, perhaps into the stubborn human habit of gathering again and again before something larger than ourselves. That is why Göbekli Tepe still holds us, not only because it is ancient, not only because it is mysterious, but because something very familiar can be heard in its stones. Fear of chaos, hunger for meaning, the desire to turn shared shock into a shared world. The hill is silent, the stone is silent. The people who made all of this are long gone, but their decision remains. It stands before us in T-shaped silhouettes, in animals carved in limestone, in deliberately buried circles, in the mistake of the 1963 expedition, in Schmidt's step onto the hill in 1994, in the first raised pillars of 1995, in the geomagnetic shadow of hidden enclosures, in modified skulls and new finds from recent years, in the name of Klaus Schmidt, in the echo of Nevali Chori, in the network of sites such as Karahan Tepe and Sefer Tepe, in the hard memory of southeastern Turkey.
And now we return to where we began. In 1994, Klaus Schmidt climbed Potbelly Hill and understood that the archaeologists from Chicago had been wrong by 11,000 years. But that mistake was not only archaeological, it was a mistake in our whole schoolbook model. Not a Byzantine cemetery instead of the Neolithic, but bread as the thing that first brought people together instead of something else. Göbekli Tepe says something very simple and very uncomfortable. Human beings became human not only when they learned to store food.
They became human also when they learned to serve together something that could not be eaten. So, the central question remains open. What truly gathered people first? Bread, fear, faith, or a story they believed in together?